For the electrical, we'll start by referring back to the system diagram. Here you can see that the main electrical involved components are the fuel pump, the fuel gauge sending unit, and the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge, important things to note is that the fuel pump and the fuel gauge need to be grounded. Both of these can be done by either drilling holes in the frame, cleaning them up, and grounding through the frame, or what I would recommend is running, let's say, a 12 gauge wire from the battery through the firewall and then through all the trim down to the back and through a grommet out the bottom, which I'll show the process of that routing. This can be used as a ground for both direct to the negative terminal of the battery. For the rest of the connections, I'll go through these in a bit. For making all of the electrical connections, I recommend using either soldered and heat shrunk waterproof connections or using proper waterproof connectors. The two main types of waterproof connectors that are used typically in off-road applications are either Deutsch style connectors or weather pack connectors. Either of these will do for this install. Technically, you can use non-waterproof connectors inside the cabin or again solder, since these don't need to be waterproof applications, but definitely anything outside of the cabin or in the engine bay will need to be waterproof. If you need to understand better how to make connections, I would research how to solder wires together and then heat shrink them, or how to install waterproof connectors. I go through the installation of some waterproof connectors here during the video. Another thing I'd like to mention is the mounting of the fuel gauge unit. I chose to mount mine as pictured here onto a switch blank. You could also mount it into the dash. This location just seemed to be the best to me. Notes on how to mount this is one, there's two different types of switch blank that come stock in the 4Runner. In the 4 slots, lower slots shown in this picture, there's a different type of blank that actually doesn't work for this. Reasoning for that is it's domed on top and there's a lot of material in the back that you'd have to deal with. The one that I used was actually out of the glove box. It's a flat blank and there's very little material behind the face, so it's perfect for this application. To mount it, what you'll need is a metric unibit that has a 20mm section, and you'll want to, in the center of the blank, drill out a 20mm hole. You want to get it as close to 20mm as possible because it can damage the switch if the unit is forced through a smaller hole, so I'd recommend using a unibit with 20mm. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to some of the ways that you can route cables through the 4Runner for this install. Start working on the switch gauge part of the electrical. If you look here, I already have the gauge installed in this location, so we'll be kind of going over how to do that. This is the factory location for, it's either the windshield or the wiper defroster or the dimmer, I don't remember which. In order to move these to other locations, if you're interested, you just take a Dremel and file off some of the tabs that don't allow you to put them into other slots, and then they can fit in all of the slots. So first thing you want to do to start mounting stuff is remove your mat. Mine's a mess. Next thing you're going to want to do is remove this. So the next thing we need to remove is this piece. Hopefully you can see this, but if you look back in here, there's this little piece. You can just hand twist this and then you can grab it and pull it off. First step to remove this piece is 10mm bolt right here. So pop that out, and then there's another one under this panel. So take a little pry tool, pop that open, and then remove that one. You need to remove this trim piece. It will not come out without doing that. In order to remove that trim piece, simply just grab it and pull it straight out. Comes out pretty easy. Okay. Now you can grab it and pull it out the rest of the way. You can usually just let it hang. I have a few extra connectors here and whatnot for various things, but just unplug any connectors you have here. And ignore the giant rat's nest I have here. I've added a lot of wiring to this. Yours won't have any of this stuff. Next thing you want to do is pull this guy out. You can just grab it and pull. There will be connectors in the back. I don't know if you can see, but you'll want to reach in with your hand and pull those. And with that, you have this module disconnected, or this piece disconnected. And again, you can mount it into any of these if you want. This is the wiring harness that comes with your fuel gauge. If you'll notice, give you quite a bit of length of wire on it actually. This plugs into the back of the unit, just like this. And there are 5 wires. I kind of have the diagram here in the background, but essentially this black wire is a ground. You'll need to ground it. You'll need to ground it up in your dash somewhere. Usually a bolt is a good spot. For example, I already have a ground of something else tapped into this bolt right here, so you could crimp a little eye let on it and mount it right there. This white-black is it's the main fuel tank sender. This is basically, this unit is smart enough to automatically start pumping if your fuel gauge or your main tank is low. But in this stall, we're not going to include that, so that'll be left disconnected. The white wire is the connection for the 0 to 90 ohm sender, the fuel gauge sender, and the little float that it was in the tank that we pulled out before. This white wire connects to how I hooked up the blue wire, so this connection on here, and then the other connection for the tank will be grounded, or for the fuel gauge sender will be grounded. This red is power in to our switch. The instructions say that you have a 12 volt ignition source. You go through a 5 amp fuse, and then you go to this red wire. Yellow is the power output. This is what you hook up to your fuel gauge. This connects to the positive end of the fuel gauge, and then the other end of the fuel gauge, the black wire, is grounded. So that's kind of an overview of the wiring. The instructions call for you, for the ignition source, to tap in to your cigarette outlet. If you don't like tapping into and cutting your stock like factory wires, there's another way you can do it. Some people don't necessarily like these, but I've used them for a while and I don't really seem to find any issues with them. But it's one of these. It's a little add a circuit type thing. You can use this to tap into your ignition source. The way this guy works is you pull the fuse that has an ignition source on it, and you put the original fuse in this lower slot, and then the top slot you add a new fuse for your new circuit. One thing to keep in mind on these is they can be pulled out kind of easily. It's put up in a location where you shouldn't have that issue, but it is possible. The location is right up in here, this factory fuse outlet here. And the one that we want to put it in is right here at the top, this very top one, right? Hard to get my finger on it, but right here it says P outlet. That's the one that you want to put it in. The reason for this is because that is the fuse for all of the power outlets in the vehicle. So using the add a fuse here is about equivalent to tapping into your cigarette lighter power source. Nice thing about these, again, is instead of adding an inline fuse, you add the fuse here. Adding an additional 5 amps will be fine to this because it's equivalent to tapping into the wiring for the ignition source. I'm going to actually do something a little bit different. What I'm going to do is I'm still going to tap into P outlet like I showed you. I'm going to go ahead and use a 3 amp fuse between this ignition source and red. And the reason I'm only going to use a 3 amp fuse is I'm actually going to have yellow go to a relay, and then the out as the control signal on the relay. The output of that relay will then go to my fuel transfer pump, and that I'll have a 5 amp fuse on. My reasoning for doing this is I don't like directly powering sources through things in the dash and through their switches. If you have a separate control signal versus power signal, you do that by your relay, you can kind of wire things up more safely, and you can actually power things that require more power. Now, this fuel pump doesn't require too much power, but there's always the potential that if you don't like how fast it pumps, you could slap a different fuel pump on, and that might require even more power. If you keep that in mind ahead of time and run this through a relay, then you could always swap in a different fuse, you know, considering you do your wiring thick enough and whatnot, and you might actually be able to just directly hook up a more powerful pump. So I'll be doing that, and then the power itself will come directly from the battery, so the power signal on the relay will come directly from the battery. So I've got my switch wired up. Don't look too much at my wiring in this case. I'm going to do it a little differently than I recommend so that it works with my current wiring setup, which will definitely be different than yours. But on this part, this will be helpful. So I'm going to show you how to feed this all the way to the rear cargo area. So what I recommend is kind of shoving this wire back through this area here. So I've gone ahead and released all of these, and now I can just start feeding this wire in. Make sure this can close as you go, especially important if you're like me and have a lot of wires in there already. First thing you'll want to do back here, just kind of lift up your floor mat, get your pry tool under here. Mine back here are not loose enough to just do with my hands, so just get your pry tool under until you can get your hands under. To get it through this middle section, what you need to do is pop off with the pry tool this little cover on the seatbelt bolt, unbolt the seatbelt, and then pop this panel up and out a little bit, and that'll give you the room to feed a wire through. Once you remove the seatbelt bolt cover, you can then unbolt it. This bolt is removed with a 14mm, and then kind of pull these seals up a bit, and then you can pop this out. Only pop it out at the bottom. You don't want to pop it out at the top because you don't need to. It'd be more work to put it back together. But this gives you the room to feed the wire through. Coming around to over here, you can now feed this through. After your wire's through, go ahead and feed it through this channel, same as before, and then reassemble this section here. Thread this in by hand, starting, because you do not want to cross thread this. Make sure your bolt or your belt is straight, and get that tightened in as much as you can with your hand. If you have a torque wrench, you can use that to retorque this bolt to the spec, which is 30 foot-pounds. Alright, at this point we need to feed the cable through all this section and over to here towards the back of the cargo area. As you can see, I've already taken this section out. This is actually a rather complicated section to take out. It requires kind of breaking some of these clips and forcing this out, or removing this entire black trim piece in order to get it out. You can technically bypass this if you get maybe like a long coat hanger or something, or send it through. I already have mine easily accessible. As you can tell, I actually have hidden power for the cargo area back here. So, but research that if you want to be able to do it this way. Another thing that helps is this little bit right here. If you pry it from the side, you can get it to come out. You can just kind of leave this loose. That'll give you a midpoint. If you're not taking this out, you're going to really want to do this. This will help you out a lot. I'm going to go ahead and feed this to this midpoint here. So next, you'll want to get it from here to the back. And again, you're going to want to use a coat hanger or something if you don't have access to this area. There's other ways to do it as well. Do some research and find a way that you think works for you. Next thing you're going to want to do is come to your cargo area. If you have your battery disconnected, you're not going to be able to open your rear hatch. So you're going to want to probably crawl in from your back seats if you have your back seats down. That being said, we don't need to do too much back here, so that would work. But what you're going to want to do is get a pry tool and pry this part up, and then a 10mm, and loosen this. Once that bolt is out, you can pry this out. Mine was a little gooey from my sound deadening. Alright, at this point I have the wire fed through all the way to this area here that we removed for the tie down. So I'm going to show you an easy way to then get this through the grommet. The grommet is about underneath here. If you look right over here is the other side of that grommet. So what you can do is feed a cable up through there and back this way, and then tape it to this and then pull it through. Now I already have a hole in mine from feeding some wires through it, so I'm going to just get this into that. So I have some forceps that I'll go ahead and use since they're nice and long. I can just grab that and pull it through. And then tape your two ends together. Then you can go back to the bottom and start pulling that through. And then we can hook it up where it needs to be. Now, in most installs, you'll have your sender wire going to the gauge on this white, and then power going to this yellow. I'm actually, since I'm powering mine separately, I'm going to have the feeder, or the gauge sender on the white, and then I'm going to have a ground for that gauge sender on my yellow. So I'm going to just plug that directly into my connections on the gauge sender. I'm going to run a completely separate set of wires to connect to my fuel pump. Alright, next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a connector onto this guy so I can plug into the fuel gauge sender. Then I'm going to use some zip ties and mount it right about here. And then we'll have the other one reach up and plug into it here. At this point I had crimped on and installed the mating connector to that of what I had shown earlier for the fuel gauge sending unit. Important thing to note on this is just make sure that your plus and minus match with what you chose earlier, because if you have those opposite, you'll run into issues, but if you match them up, you'll be just fine. Not shown in the video here, but later on I ended up kind of looping the connector back so I could zip tie it along the length of the cable leading up to it. Kind of the reason for this was so that the connector itself wasn't capable of moving. For the wiring on the fuel pump, I ran a second set of cables the same way I had for the fuel gauge sender, from the front of the vehicle to the back for the power for the fuel pump. The cables then went through the firewall in the dash and connected to an automotive relay, as I showed in the diagram. The relay was just mounted under the hood, and then I had the output of the yellow wire from the gauge going to the control signal for the automotive relay, as is shown in the diagram. In order to keep the connector for the fuel pump power from moving, I used a cable clamp and the extra length of the bolt that was used to mount the fuel pump itself. I mounted the cable clamp there and then clamped the cable coming from the front of the vehicle to that location there. With some stiff heat shrink on the end of that, I was able to get it so the connector wouldn't move, and then the connector coming from the fuel pump then wouldn't be able to move by being plugged into this. And with that, the electrical is complete.